Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Centre for the Study of Governance and Society Zoom seminar. I'm Mark Pennington, the director of the Centre. We've recently started a new project on the political economy of knowledge and ignorance, which aims to explore fundamental questions about power, rationality, and the epistemic properties of alternative governance regimes. Perhaps no one has done more in recent years to contribute to our understanding of these issues than today's speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein. Cass is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School, where he's the director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. Having previously worked for the Obama administration, he's also currently working for the Biden administration in the United States. Normally at this point, I might read out all the major books that our speaker has contributed, but in Cass Sunstein's case, the list is just too long to get through. If I may though, I'd like to pull out a few of my personal favorites. Free Markets and Social Justice is a wonderful discussion of the limits and the possible contribution of market institutions to contributing towards just social outcomes. Laws of Fear, Beyond the Precautionary Principle, is an incredibly relevant book in the context of the kind of experiences we've all been going through in the last year. Infotopia, How Many Minds Produce Knowledge, is a wonderful discussion of effectively the knowledge-enhancing properties of crowd-type situations, but also problems of groupthink. Finally, The Cost-Benefit Revolution is a wonderful discussion of the strengths and limits of cost-benefit thinking in public policy. Of course, in recent years, Cass has become very famous, if he wasn't already famous enough, for the work he's done alongside Richard Thaler, developing ideas in behavioral political economy and the concept of nudge. Today, he's going to speak to us on the subject of not wanting to know. Cass will speak for about 40 minutes. We won't be taking questions during the talk itself, but we invite you to put your questions in the chat box and the Q&A box during the talk or after the talk, when we'll then curate them and put them to Cass. So welcome, Cass, to our centre, and thanks for joining us so early in the morning for this event.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a joy to be able to speak to you because this topic is extremely central to all academic fields, I think, with the possible exception of linguistics, but maybe even there, and because the topic is relevant and goes to the heart of our species. I have two epigraphs for you. The first ends with some words that are famous, but I'd love it if you'd listen, and I'm going to try to hear the words myself as if they were new. It's from Thomas Gray's Ode on a Distant Prospect at Eton College. And he's speaking about young people, in this case, young men, and observing their hopes and joy and delight and exuberance in getting to be alive. And this is the last stanza. To each his sufferings, all are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, why should they know their fate, since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies? Thought would destroy their paradise. No more, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That's a plea for the welfare increasing characteristics of ignorance. And that's going to be a principal theme here. The second epigraph is from the other side of the coin. It's from A.S. Byatt's Possession, the greatest novel in the English language. Don't argue. And Byatt is describing a romance between a poet and a poetess. And in an early missive from the poet to his romantic partner-to-be. The poet writes by letter, "I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things, once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done with what I need never have embarked on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable?" Now that's a seductive paragraph. It's also recognizing the heterogeneity of preferences with respect to knowing things, and it is a plea for knowledge as a great good. And possession plays on the book of Genesis and the tree of knowledge as maybe it rewrites the story of the Garden of Eden with a more embracing attitude toward eating the apple and learning. Okay, I have two stories for you. The first involves public policy. When I worked in the government at my last round, I was part of a team exploring a mandate for calorie labels. And the consensus among the group was that restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King and Subway should be included, but we didn't have the data to include movie theaters. So the group was, we would compel disclosure of calories, and in that sense take Bayat's side, not Gray's side with respect to knowledge, and we would flood the system with information for them, but we would not include movie theaters. I, in the group, was part of a defeated minority that thought that movie theaters should be included. And what we did was we proposed a rule that would not include movie theaters, but we left ourselves the option of including them if public comments suggested, not by referendum that people wanted it, but by data that on balance it would be a good thing. We thought we didn't have the data, but maybe the public comment period would provide it. And sure enough, to the surprise of the majority, the public comment period, including people who work on calorie labels and obesity and diabetes, that's their profession, suggested that including movie theaters was the right call. And that's exactly what we did in the final rule. I sent a note to a friend celebrating the ultimate decision, and the answer came back in 3 words: Cass ruined popcorn. Cass ruined popcorn. Now, I thought that was entertaining as well as deflating. It also signaled something that I think none of us had paid sufficient attention to, which is the adverse welfare effects of getting calorie information with respect to popcorn when one is in a movie theater. And in fact, there's recent data confirming the 3-word deflationary note, suggesting that for people who have self-control problems and probably have issues of weight, the consequence of calorie labels is to induce sadness, maybe a little anger, it's negative, and not to change choices. So pause over that if you would. The mandate, it seems, there's data supportive of the conclusion, is giving welcome information to people who don't need it, but whose choices are affected by it, and giving unwelcome information to people who don't change their behavior as a result. Okay, the second story, with your indulgence, is going to be a personal story. And it comes from decades ago. When I was in college, my father, a 60-something athletic guy, started to stumble on the tennis court. And my brother-in-law noticed this unusual stumbling and insisted that my mother and I take my father to the hospital for tests. After a battery of tests, my father and I were starting lunch in the hospital room, and my mother came in and said, said to me, your father's fine, and said to her husband, you are fine, I have terrific news. There's nothing to worry about. The doctors have uncovered no problem. They're not sure exactly what it is, but what they are sure is that it's nothing bad. And so we had a celebratory lunch there in the hospital, and I felt very relieved, as did my father. And after that, my mother took me down to the parking lot to take me back to college. I will never forget the expression on her face as we entered the car. It was the first and only time I've seen despair on a human face, and it's a memorable thing to see. And she said, I lied. The tests actually were devastating. Your father is going to die in a year if he's lucky. He has an inoperable brain tumor. But I'm not going to tell him, and neither are you. She laid down the law. What my mother was saying in that exchange was, we have some time, which can be normal, to protect him. We are not going to tell him the horrific news until he can't avoid it. And I think she was implicitly saying to protect her marriage and herself, she was not going to disclose the truth because she didn't want a tombstone staring them both in the face at the relevant time. That was something she wanted to avoid. So what my mother was basically saying is, we're not going to ruin popcorn for your father. And that was, I think, the start of this project. With respect to issues in public policy, this enterprise is motivated in some ways by my own policy failure, which is when I was in the government under President Obama, we were exploring in real time a wide range of information disclosure requirements, including fuel economy, calorie labels as noted, genetic modification of food, ingredients in products, and much more. And we didn't get sufficient clarity, I think, on the underlying welfare questions about information. Okay, together with collaborators, including most prominently Professor Reich of Cambridge University, I have been engaged in an empirical project about what people want to know all over the world. And I'm going to give you just a glimpse into the data by way of getting traction on some of the normative and theoretical questions. And I'm going to give you a glimpse at some of the pilot data from One Nation, but the important point for present purposes is that the data is qualitatively consistent across nations. There are some cross-national differences, but the basic story is not fundamentally different from the story I'm about to tell you based on the data in, I confess, the United States. About 27% of people want to know the year of their death. That is the loser in terms of the contest between Thomas Gray and A.S. Byatt. People do not want to lay aside the unprofitable. Strong majorities in every country we looked at do not want to know the year of their death. 43% of people want to know the calories in their meals in the next year. That's striking, especially given the fact that 80 to 90% of people want the law to require disclosure of calories at restaurants. That's a real incongruity that people support a calorie mandate via law, but they personally, a majority, do not want to know the calories in their meals. They don't want popcorn to be ruined. About 47% of people want to know if they are going to get Alzheimer's. A majority doesn't. About 58% of people want to know if they're going to get a serious cancer. It's higher than Alzheimer's. It may be that Alzheimer's has a particularly negative affect associated with it. Only 42% of people want to know what their friends and family really think of them. They don't want visibility into that. In a large group that's very close to nationally representative, and I only did this in the United States, 58% of people want to know whether the person on whom they have a crush, for whom they have romantic feelings, reciprocate, which is to say 42% of people don't want to know. Is that because they think it would be dangerous to get an affirmative answer? Is it because they think they'll get bad news? Nonetheless, it's not much more than a majority. Interestingly to me, and hilariously to me, I did the same survey among Harvard undergraduates, a relatively small sample, and close to 100% of Harvard undergraduates want to know whether the person for whom they have romantic feelings reciprocate those feelings. Is that because Harvard undergraduates are confident that the answer will be what they want? Is it instead because they are single? Is it because if not single, they don't really care, they really want to know? Only 42% of people want to know how much warmer the planet will be in 2100. A strong majority don't. 53% of people want to know if there's a heaven, which is to suggest there's a pretty even division among Americans on that question. Only 44% of people want to know that whether there's a hell. Significant difference. With respect to information that policymakers might require disclosure of, we see both a relatively narrow band where the lowest with respect to safety or health or economically relevant information tends to be about 50%, maybe a little higher, and the highest tends to be about 67%. I find that intriguing, the narrowness of the band. Relatively high, 67% of people want safety ratings for tires. About 65% people want to know the side effects of pain relievers. But for other things, the numbers are slightly lower in terms of percentage. Okay, knowing what people want to know is noteworthy. Knowing with what intensity they want to know it is also interesting. The most administrable measure of intensity is an economic measure. And in terms of willingness to pay to receive the information, the annual payments are typically modest in the nature of maybe 30 euros, 40 euros, up on the high end to 80 euros to get relevant information over the course of a year. With Professor Reich, she had the lead on this paper. We also asked about how much they paid not to receive information. And there the numbers are typically lower, but they are positive. An aggregated willingness to pay analysis would suggest that mandatory labeling in cases in which governments think about it is probably a winner, but it's not a spectacular winner. And the way you do it is a little arithmetic by multiplying willingness to pay times the percentage of people who want it and subtracting from that willingness to pay not to receive times the number of people who don't want it. And then you get a number, and that number is typically positive. Okay, I confess for a long period, the data was in search of a theory. So the data was collected, at least by me, without a hypothesis, just with immense curiosity. I wanted to know, and I was willing to pay in time and to some extent in money to find out, but I did not have a hypothesis going in. Here's a way of organizing the findings, both the heterogeneity and the disparity. It's an effort to describe something in the nature of a framework. Where there are three parts of an informal welfare analysis that people are engaged in deciding whether they want information. The first has to do with instrumental value. Can the information be used? Will getting it make something in life go better than it would otherwise do? And we could imagine offhand information which can help you save money, not get sick, enjoy your life better, or we can imagine information that would have the opposite effect. To know, for example, the guilt or innocence of a client can impair a lawyer's performance. To know something about how you did on a test might impair your performance on another test because it could be demoralizing. And there's some information that's neutral with respect to instrumental value. For the Alzheimer data, the hypothesis now we have one, is that some people think if I get that information, I can do an assortment of things that I wouldn't otherwise do, and that would be good to do given what's coming. And we have another set of people who think I'm not going to live my life any differently, so the information is essentially useless. And still other people thinking that this will impair my capacity to do various things because I'll maybe be thinking I'm getting Alzheimer's when I'm not, or I'll be sad in a way that will make my ability to promote my goals less. Okay, so if we focus on instrumental value, we might have a kind of neo-Millian preliminary account of respect for heterogeneity with respect to wanting to know. And this would be kind of the implicit political economy of Bayet's recognition of heterogeneity between an N of two, himself and his partner to be. Okay, the second part of the three-part framework is the hedonic effect of receiving the information. So some people are thinking receiving the information will induce a positive affect, and some people are thinking it will make me miserable. And that hedonic impact of the information is a driver of people's not wanting to know or wanting to know. That fits nicely with the lowest performer of the numerous do you want to know questions, which is, do you want to know the year of your death? People don't want to know because that will make them feel terrible. That will ruin popcorn. There's heterogeneity here, that some people knowing that they're going to get cancer or their risk of get cancer, that is a horrifying thing to know, which outweighs the instrumental value of knowing it. And for others, it's a blow to be sure, but it's something which people think, well, it happens and I can handle it. I want to know so that I can adjust accordingly. So it's likely that there's a quick intuitive assessment of the magnitude of the instrumental value, positive or negative, and the magnitude of the hedonic impact, and that supports a welfare assessment that fits with the data. There's a third factor which is probably not playing a large role in the data, which probably does play a role in wanting to know and not wanting to know. We should distinguish, by the way, wanting not to know from not wanting to know, where not wanting to know means you don't want the information, but if you receive it, you're not worse off. Wanting not to know, signaled by the hedonic value, is you affirmatively would pay or do something to avoid the information. Okay, the third has to do with what might be called cognitive value. So if you want to know whether Shakespeare wrote all of Shakespeare's plays, or as I do, I'm keenly interested in that question, or whether dogs are descended from wolves, and if so, in what sense, which seems to me something I really want to know. It's not because my life would be changed in any way by learning the answer to those questions, and it's not because any particular answer would please me. It's that I would like to know, and both of those things I pay to know. Okay, thus far the account is tending toward a broadly Millian picture, which fits with On Liberty and which suggests that people's desire for information, as with their life experiences broadly, should be determined by themselves, and unless there's harm to others of some sort, let them figure it out. And that would support a particular policy approach, which I'll get to in a moment. But the behavioral science on information acquisition, as well as on choices generally, puts some bold, meaning in bold font, question marks next to On Liberty, and suggests in the particular context here, people's information seeking and information avoidance might be boundedly rational. If people suffer or benefit from present bias, it may be that they will avoid information which it's very much in their interest to obtain. And we know that people with respect to information seeking with respect to health frequently make a hedonic forecasting error. That is, they believe that the devastating effect of bad news will be persistent when in fact they adapt over time. So present bias can lead to information avoidance based on a prediction of the welfare effects of receiving information, which is wrong. Take that with respect and trepidation, Mr. Mill, that is, the chooser might blunder. We know also that human beings tend to suffer or maybe benefit from unrealistic optimism, which might lead to insufficient and excessive information seeking, where people thinking the news is going to be good seek it, where an objective calculus of the welfare effects would suggest they ought not to, or would suggest that optimistically biased people would not seek out information, thinking they're fine and they're not at risk, even in circumstances in which they are. Optimistic bias and present bias together can confound the account, which would support fully the judgment that heterogeneity with respect to information seeking is consistent with rationality on the part of people with different preferences and values. Okay, for policy, nations all over the world have a task, which is to think, and I'm focusing on the regulatory context now, though it's a much broader question, ought we to mandate disclosure of, let's say, the energy efficiency of appliances, or the fuel economy of cars, or the effects of sunscreen on, let's say, tanning and cancer, or whether genetically modified food is present in carrots or calories, etc. It's a very long list. And whether to mandate disclosure, and if so, how, should depend on a welfare calculation. At least that's a plausible view. Many regulators, and I confess I was one of these, find the welfare assessment so challenging that all one can say is, we don't know. As Keynes said of many predictions about future outcomes, we don't know. But that is a counsel of despair and not a very good thing for regulators in democratic or non-democratic societies to say. So what you would like to do, I think, is to do the best you can to assess welfare. If we have an assessment of what majorities want to know and what they don't want to know, we're doing better than we would do if we just said, we don't know, though we want to as regulators. If we could measure not only up or down with respect to desire for information, but also intensity, as Professor Reich and I have done a bit, then we'd be in better shape. Still, we could make a rough and ready welfare calculus. Okay, the problem with that is to know whether you want information, you have to know something about the value of information. And that may not be the case. The relevant population might not know enough to make informed judgments about whether it wants to know. Kenneth Arrow drew attention to this problem decades ago, and in some cases, it's a very severe problem. Do you want to know the calories in your food? Well, to answer that question, you need to be informed about something about what calories mean and why it might be useful to have fewer of them. And if part or a significant part of the population doesn't have that information, that's a problem. It might also be the case that even if people have the relevant information, their own desire to know or not to know and intensity is affected by a behavioral bias. And the kind of parent, let's call her or him, of all behavioral biases in this context is the solving a very hard prediction problem. That is how your welfare would be improved or diminished by receiving information. That's very challenging in this context. which leads us to the conclusion that experienced well-being, at least on welfarist grounds, is the gold standard, and regulators should do the best they can to track the experienced well-being of people who receive or don't receive information. And the good news is that behavioral research is increasingly approaching answers to those questions, which suggests that we have at least an understanding of what we care about, unless not for deontological reasons, we care about something else. Maybe we can get into that in the question. But experienced well-being is what matters, and we might have proxies for that. Okay, I guess I'll say that regulators do have some tools by which to improve on the "we don't know" answer to the question of welfare effects. I can speak, if you like, in the discussion of some of the less beautiful and more beautiful tools they have. I'm going to conclude by giving you some data which connects with what I just said, which is experienced well-being as the gold standard. And it's about Facebook. Some of this data I've collected myself, but I'm going to give you data which is more vivid than what my own research has uncovered, compatible with it, but more vivid. And it's a conundrum. Here is the finding. If you ask people how much they'd have to be paid to be off Facebook for a month, a lot of them will say roughly €100. Now take that subgroup of the population, very large, and let's say we do an experiment and tell half of them, sorry, you're out of luck, we're not going to give you that €100. And we tell the other half, you're in luck, we're going to make that deal with you. This is a real study. And then let's suppose in that month, we track everything about the lived experience of people in the two groups. The control group, which is still with Facebook for the month, and the treatment group, which is off for a month and €100 richer. It's actually dollars, but that's a detail. Here's what the data finds, that the people off Facebook for a month enjoy their life better in terms of happiness measures through surveys. They're more satisfied with their lives. They are less anxious, and they are less depressed. On every measure of experienced well-being, the people having the month without Facebook are better off, not massively better off, but significantly better off than those who stay on Facebook. That suggests that being off Facebook and receiving less information of the sort that Facebook provides is welfare positive. Then that population is asked, how much would you have to be paid to be off Facebook for another month? The answer, on average, €87. That's an intriguing answer. The reason it's intriguing is, given the data, you might expect them to say, you don't have to pay me anything. I'll pay you because I'm better off without it. That's not the answer. The answer is significantly lower than it was before. So people did learn that being off Facebook was less bad than they had thought going in, but still it's a positive. €87. We don't know what accounts for that number. So the researchers are agnostic about the account. I'm going to give two, and I'm not sure which is right. One is that people want the information, much of which involves news, by the way, even though it doesn't make them happier. So they are thinking there's instrumental and cognitive value in receiving the information I get on Facebook, even though my hedonic state is lowered. So they're making a rational, rough and ready calculation about the welfare benefits, and they say a little lower than I had thought before, but still significantly higher than zero. That's actually the researchers' preferred account. The alternative account is they're making a mistake, either through some form of addiction or through an understanding of prevailing social norms, or just a mistake about the welfare effect of being on Facebook. That number, which should be zero, is as high as 87. There's probably heterogeneity within the population that averages 87, where some are, let's say, willing to be sadder but wiser and insistent on that, and others are making an error. Okay, I'm done with the remarks. The general theme, which has been mostly implicit, is to support the general view that ruining popcorn is sometimes a very unkind thing to do, and to give a kind of nod of the head to my mother under very difficult circumstances, and to suggest when we're thinking of what policy or of, let's call it welfarism in the broadest sense, to recognize the importance of, let's say, considered ignorance is more than a mercy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cass. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really fascinating stuff. So we've already got one question in the Q&A box already, which I'll read out now. But just to encourage other participants to put your questions in the Q&A box so we can put them to Cass. So the first question is from Otto. Putting aside all the biases at play, do people have stable preferences about not wanting to know to begin with? Is there evidence whether the epistemic preferences that you cite about time of death, cancer, Alzheimer's, etc., are more the result of careful deliberation or the result of on-the-spot thinking manifested specifically for the research questionnaires?
It's a great question. So the surveys are on the spot. So whether this is a deliberative judgment or not is not clear. There are ways of finding out, but yours truly hasn't. On the stability of dispositions with respect to not wanting to know, George Lowenstein has done work on this and finds that there are. Now, it's not the case. There's some people who profoundly want to know what happened in the Olympics and don't want to know at all what happened in American baseball. And there are some people who profoundly want to know whether they're going to get cancer, but don't really care about calorie labels. So the issue really matters in the survey. Lowenstein's work finds that people can be sorted into being dispositional information seekers and information avoiders, and that disposition is highly predictive of how they're likely to answer a series of questions. And my guess is that a little self-scrutiny on the part of all of us can reveal what type we are, and that will be predictive of our, let's say, average answers to a battery of questions. I think, by the way, and this is speculative, but I think that the continuity between people's brisk survey answer and their answer on reflection would be really high. That's how it typically is with respect to things like, do you like this kind of candy or that kind of candy? Do you want this kind of car or that kind of car? Their immediate answers are highly predictive of their ultimate judgments.
Okay, great. We've got quite a few questions coming in now. So Sarah Lilly, do people not want to know the future because they don't want to think that it is fixed?
Okay, that's also a great question. You could ask them, so as I recall, some of the data says that whether it's fixed or not is not a main driver of people's judgments. So one way to do it is to say, do you want to know whether you will get cancer? Another is, do you want to know the probability band with respect to your getting cancer? That would be a way of testing it. Now, what I don't know is whether the word cancer would drive their answers, or whether some people would say a probability band induces less adverse hedonic effect and also suggests there's something I can do about it. So I want to know. It's a great question, and it should be tested. So here's a hypothesis. This one I'm going to have a hypothesis going in, that probability bands are much more conducive to affirmative answers, both because the instrumental value suddenly leaps and because the adverse hedonic effect suddenly plummets.
Wow. So some more questions. This is from Ashka Tank. Dr. Sunstein, in relation to your explanation of people wanting the information from Facebook, despite it lowering their hedonic status, do you think that the hedonic status is possibly increased, even if it is bad news one gets, if it confirms one's pessimistic view of the world?
That's great. Okay. So there are two psychological phenomena that are often combined. One is familiar, confirmation bias, and the other is less familiar, desirability bias. So let's talk about that, shall we? People, if I tend to think that things are going to go terribly with respect to climate change, let's say, and I read material suggesting that it's actually awful, it might be that that's pleasing to me, even though the fact that the world is going to get really, really hot is not desirable. Desirability bias would suggest that if I think that the world's going to get really hot, learning that I was right should make me miserable. So we need a contest between desirability bias and confirmation bias. And the only one I know of finds that desirability bias wins. The only direct comparison, it's about political candidates and people who think their own political candidate is likely to lose are actually more responsive to information suggesting their preferred political candidate is likely to win. So they don't want to be confirmed. They are more responsive to information suggesting that what they hope will happen will happen. I have some data on climate change, which actually tends in the other direction, suggesting that people who believe the climate is going to get really, really hot are very receptive to undesirable information that confirms their priors.
Wow. So lots of questions coming in. So the next one is from Anastasia Lacroix. Knowing the consequences of ruining popcorn, would you still do it?
Yes, and the reason is that the data suggests that the people who want the information are more numerous and more enthusiastic about getting the information than the people who don't want the information. So on welfare grounds, it looks like a positive. But I'm more cautious about it than I was before, given the data just described. I'm hopeful, and this may be desirability bias, that the people who are made sadder by the information also in the relatively long run will benefit from it in terms of their health, in part because the offerings will shift, because companies don't like providing information that turns out, providing products that sell less. And on balance, high calorie items should sell less, given the fact that the majority pays attention to them. So here's another way to put it. The regulator's impulse, I didn't mention this, but is to look at health endpoints and to ask how many lives do you save or illnesses do you avoid, and then do a little multiplication to see the welfare effects. And on that grounds, calorie labels look like a winner. The health endpoints matter, but they're an incomplete account of the welfare effects, because even if people are living, let's say, longer lives and healthier lives, if they're sadder, then you have to subtract the sadder. So if you banned what each of us considers the most delicious thing in the world, we wouldn't be better off, even if what most of us consider the most delicious thing in the world is really fattening.
Great question here from Hella Pozdam. What does this do to our obligation as scholars to disseminate our research? In Danish university law, this is explicitly mentioned as an obligation.
What a great question. I'd be very reluctant to say that people should withhold research on the ground that it makes people sad. So I'm thinking about regulators. So I'm going to take bias side here without having thought it fully through. If researchers find, let's say, that that some product is really bad for people, it's possible that that will have adverse hedonic effects that outweigh their positive instrumental effects. I think that would be unlikely, but it's possible. But it would be very, what's the right word, severe to say that information should be withheld for that reason. So with respect to research, a very strong presumption in favor of letting people figure out what's true, maybe with the unrealistically optimistic belief that eventually that's to the species' benefit. Let's have that be our theology for the day.
Okay, the next question is from Mahesh Pudyal. Is there work done on how far people are willing to go in terms of effort cost to not know things they don't want to know?
Preliminary, we need much more. So we know that when the stock market is doing very well, people tend to consult their portfolios a lot. And when the stock market is doing poorly, people consult it less. It's hard to justify that on instrumental grounds, because if your value is plummeting, you maybe should know about it and adjust accordingly. But people will undertake effort to learn in circumstances in which they're going to get good news, and they won't undertake effort to learn where they're going to get bad news. There's some new work on, also from George Lowenstein, it's not published yet, which suggests with respect to effort to change behavior, if people think there's a risk of loss from it, they won't undertake that effort. And if they think there's likely to be significant gain, they will undertake that effort. And this work it's not quite about information seeking, but it's really close. And it's supportive of the hypothesis that if people think the news is going to make them really sad, they'll run from it unless they think it will be of great instrumental value.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Alejo Gascon. Thanks for the talk. In the Facebook study, did the researchers find how the time not spent on Facebook was used? If the individuals were allowed to use Instagram, Twitter, or others, that would only mean that one social media provides more happiness than the other. I mean, the study might be weak if we do not know the opportunity cost for not using Facebook.
They did study that, and as I recall, this is with high but not complete confidence, the substitution was television.
Right. Okay. Next question is from Rocco Santuri. Given the emergence of democratic backsliding worldwide, do you think those types of political environments are fertile ground for governments to take advantage of those who don't want to know about politics and increase a push towards authoritarianism?
Excellent question. And I just don't know the answer to that. It's an empirical question and very unclear. I'll tell you a little bit more about the Facebook study that will bear on this question. The one measure along which, or the one most noteworthy measure along which the control group was better off than the treatment group, is that the treatment group, that is the people who were on Facebook for a month, they knew less about politics. definitely less, significantly less. So that's the one measure along which being off Facebook for the month made people worse off. Now, consistent with that $87 demand is rational, is that the population was thinking, we're a little sadder, sure, but we're also significantly less informed, and we don't like that. So to keep us uninformed for another month, you're going to have to pay us almost as much as we demanded for the first. It's not clear that that's the right explanation, but it's consistent with the data. And that would suggest that what happens in nations in which there's democratic backsliding is very unpredictable. It might be that the demand for information on the part of people experiencing democratic backsliding remains high, gets higher.
Okay, I think we've got an open queue at the moment. So people, if you do have more questions, please do keep putting them in the Q&A box. Or while you're doing that, I'll just ask a question of my own. So I was thinking about how does this apply to the thought process of people doing regulation, politicians and regulators? So do we have any data on what politicians or regulators want to know about the character of the populations that they are regulating or managing, and about their own capacity to actually address various social problems?
Okay, so this hasn't been studied systematically, but this has been my job. So I'll talk about it a little bit. I'll talk anecdotally, not analytically, about Europe, and then I'll talk a little more about North America. So there's a proudly called high-level regulatory cooperation council between the EU and the United States, where ideas are exchanged about regulation. And my impression, so this is anecdotal, is that in Europe, disclosure of relevant information is warmly received, and the idea of letting consumers get the information that is relevant to their choices has a big check mark next to it. And there isn't a lot of, with apologies if this is wrong, and even if it's right, there isn't a lot of fine-grained welfare analysis of whether on balance it's a good idea. In Canada, and this is also going to be recklessly anecdotal, there's a great deal of interest in getting approaches that stakeholders agree make sense. So with respect to information disclosure, if relevant persons, let's say environmental groups, consumer groups, industry, can converge on an approach that they find agreeable, that will be somewhere between helpful and a strong signal that it's a good idea. And I want to be very careful and say this is anecdotal with respect to Canada. In the United States, there's an obligation by executive order to analyze the welfare effects. So for a fuel economy label, the obligation is to figure out what's its impact going to be, how much is it going to cost, what effects will it have on pollution, what effects will it have on consumers. But that's an obligation that is within the bounds of feasibility. And it might be just the information might not be available. So the government might say, we just don't know. Help. Houston, we have a problem. But it might be that there's no Mission Central that can tell you how to take Apollo 13, how to land it, forgive the metaphor. And then regulators might do the following. This is part of the toolbox. And this is something I regard as very helpful. It's called break-even analysis, where you might say, let's suppose the fuel economy label performs as poorly as it possibly could. what are its benefits in terms of consumer savings and environmental. Now, if it performs really poorly, but if the benefits of its weakest self exceed the cost, then it should be done. Or suppose it performs as well as it possibly could, that the assumptions that produce an assessment are really very hopeful. And let's suppose even on the most optimistic account, the benefits don't come close to the costs, then it shouldn't be done. So break-even analysis, I think in decision theory, is a way of proceeding in the face of epistemic gaps, and some regulators use it. More often, the welfare assessment calls for health or economic endpoints. And that's good. That's better than break-even analysis if you can come up with it. Think of graphic warning labels for cigarettes. You might be able to project mortality gains from that. You might have at least lower and upper bounds, and then you might be in business. But if the analysis thus far is right, the graphic warning question is actually much more interesting than the health endpoints. You might make some smokers really miserable if they see the graphic warnings, and they won't quit. And you'll get some to quit, and then to think of what are the welfare benefits for those who quit. And then the endogeneity of preferences becomes relevant. And this is, I think, a deep theoretical and practical issue for regulators, where if you shift, and this is something that confounds, I think, Mill's harm principle, if you shift from, let's say, hamburger to vegetable, you might hate that. But it might be after 6 months, you're liking the vegetables better and you're thinking, oh, hamburger, disgusting. Now, on welfare grounds, that's really important to know. Whether it's admissible for the government to think of the endogeneity of preferences, that's a fair question. It seems to some creepy for the government to think we can induce the preferences that we want people to have.
We've got some more questions that have come in. So this is from Stephen Metcalf. My understanding is that most of this work has focused on lack of knowledge as opposed to mis or disinformation. Do you have any thoughts on misbeliefs? For example, might some who have strong beliefs in conspiracy theories be more likely to want to not know the truth in an active way rather than not wanting to know more passively?
The data on conspiracy theories is consistent with that great question, so that people who believe conspiracy theory A are inclined to believe conspiracy theory B, even if they're logically inconsistent. So people who believe that Princess Diana was killed by people from, a plot of people from some country are also likely to believe that Princess Diana is still alive and hiding. So there seems to be some affective commitment to conspiracy theories as such, which might make it very hard to dislodge a conspiracy theory because people derive utility from the belief. So that's that. Okay, thank you for that. The idea of utility-induced beliefs is an umbrella on which the topic today is sitting, and to believe that a conspiracy is real might, even if it's a terrible thing, might organize the world for the believer and in some way be comforting. There's a terrific old book called When Prophecy Fails, which is people who thought the world was going to end on a date certain. I think it's from 1958 by Stanley Schachter and probably Leon Festinger also, how they dealt with the fact that their belief that the world was going to end turned out to be false. And they ran fast to another sibling belief that I don't remember, it was something like they were spared because they were faithful to the God who was going to end the world, or that it's going to end in a year. They got it off. They were off by a year. So yes, is the shorter answer to your question.
I think we've just got time to get through a couple more. So I'll just try to get through these couple more questions we've got left. So Lula Rappaport, we live in a time where we have increasing agency to choose what information we want to consume due to social media and the multiplicity of media outlets online. Do you think if your research had been conducted 50 years ago, when information was more homogeneous and certain information was unavoidable, that your research would yield different results?
Okay, the premise is right, and the speculation is that we wouldn't get a different result. It's a speculation, but the idea is that people are making in the data some sort of quick assessment of, is this information useful to me, and how's it going to make me feel? And that would be true 50 years ago and 500 years ago, as well as 50 years from now. But with respect to 500 years from now, who knows?
Next question, which is probably going to be the last one, actually. So this is from Mark Lopatan. Great talk. Can you speak about the current meta-narrative about existential risk, climate change, and loss of complex ecological systems? Is the meta story stuck at 5 to midnight, in that the story always leaves time for urgent action and repair? If so, what impact do you think this is having on information seeking?
Okay, that's also a great question. So if you have, okay, I'll get at this through the side door. A candidate for the best unknown social science paper is called Solution Aversion. And it says that it finds, it doesn't say, it finds that if people think that the solution to a problem is horrible, they will deny the existence of a problem. So give the example of climate change. If people think the response to climate change is extremely high carbon taxes and energy shortages, they will think, climate change isn't real. But if they think that the response to climate change is unleashing of entrepreneurial activity and inventiveness with respect to exciting alternative sources, then they'll think, yes, I believe in climate change. And this suggests that existential risk narratives could both arrest in a good way human attention, or could make people think there's no solution, or the solution is not likely to work, so I might as well deny the existence of the problem, or I'm inclined to. So I think desirability bias is relevant to how to think about all this. But which has the larger effect? That is the, I don't want to believe it because it's so terrifying, or better get to work because it's so terrifying, to be determined.
Okay, that's fantastic. We're at 13:36 UK time. Cass has actually got to go to get on with his day job in about 3 or 4 minutes. So I think at this point, we've had, I think, a fantastic presentation and also some really fantastic questions there that presentation has sparked. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody else for attending this event, and special thanks to Cass for such a stimulating presentation. And I hope at some point we're actually able to get you over here in person to carry on the conversation. So thank you very much to you, Cass, and thanks to everyone for attending today.
Thanks to you. Hope to visit soon.
Thank you. That's excellent. Okay, goodbye, everybody, wherever you are. Have a good day. Bye-bye.